ProfileStore is a brand new, easy to use, and open source module that takes care of data saving for you. It comes with tons of benefits that you don't get by using normal data stores. It's really easy to set up. It handles auto-saving data, server crashes, and other errors. It also has session locking, which prevents multiple servers from editing one player's data at the same time, which is a common cause of item loss or item duplication glitches. It's super efficient with data store calls, meaning you also don't have to worry about Roblox's API limits anymore, which also means you can use it on large projects which have potentially hundreds of players in the same server. ProfileStore is the newer and better successor to ProfileService, which was a past module and wrapper for data store management, also made by Rileybytes or Mad Studio Roblox. One of the biggest reasons why you should be using ProfileStore, the module leaves you with all of the freedom to decide how you want to handle player data, which we'll get into later in this video when I set up a very modular system of changing and editing player data. Essentially, this is just a wrapper or an alternate API on top of data stores that simplifies it and fixes a lot of the problems for you, but you still get complete control over your game and how you save data. So how does it work? The module creates profile objects which can be assigned to players or other things like clans or worlds, but the profile objects just hold that player's data and also handle all of the benefits that we just talked about before. So looking through the basic usage section of the docs, we can see the structure of data setup. And guys, don't worry if this is intimidating. We'll walk through the script step by step in a minute and make sure it's all really simple and easy to understand. And the best part is once we do this once, you don't really have to do it again. So we can see what this script is doing is that when a player gets added, we start a new profile for that player. And then we just run through some functions here. We add the user ID and add some data, and then all we need to do is store this profile into tables so that we can go get it later. And from then on, ProfileStore handles everything else for you. It can handle server crashing. It can handle players getting disconnected. It does the session locking so players can't duplicate items. And if you're still wondering if you should use this module or not instead of the basic data store, if we take a look through Roblox's data store template here, you can just kind of see how complicated this is. There are all kinds of set and update functions. You need these pcall, protected call functions really often. There are limits on how often you can actually access the data store. So if you do it too often, it'll start dropping calls and then players will lose data. They'll leave your game, they'll rejoin, they'll be missing whatever they've earned in the last session. It's kind of a problem. ProfileStore is going to take care of all of this for you and just give you a really easy to use API on top of it so that you can kind of use it and then forget about it after that. If you're familiar with ProfileService, which was the past version of this module, you might be wondering if you should switch over to this new version. For one, the autosave period has been increased, but it's more reliable now, which means you'll have way fewer data store calls. It's a lot more performant because of that, and it uses cross-server messaging service to handle session locking and other cross-server communications. It's been updated to reflect modern changes to Roblox's data store. It's got a lot better type completion. And one of my favorite things is that the API has been cleaned up a lot. So it's a lot more modern and it's a lot easier to understand and read the API. Not only that, but the profiles themselves have added in a few more events that make it a lot easier to set up custom logic. So let's get into how to download this. I've linked the model for this below. So what we're going to do is go to the description and find the first link. And then you can come into the Roblox creator store and get this model for free. So add it into your inventory and then head over to your Roblox Studio project. Once you have ProfileStore in your toolbox, you can just go ahead and click on it to insert it into your game. And then we're going to just take this module and drag it down into server script service. Organization is going to be important, so I'm going to add a couple of folders. One of them is just going to be a libraries folder. This is where putting external libraries is always super useful. And the other folder will just be a data folder. This will be what we put the scripts in that actually handle the player's data. So inside of this, we're going to need a couple of scripts. We're going to first need a module script, which we'll call template. And template will be the base template for a data table for the players in your game. So if you want to start your player off with gold, let's say 10 gold. When a new player joins the game, they'll have 10 gold. If they have an inventory, you can have an inventory table in here. This will make sure that every new player starts off your game with this template. Next up, we're just going to add a server script, and we'll call this server script data init, or data initialization for short. And inside here is where we're going to be running through the basic setup of the profile that we saw before. So the first thing we're going to need is a few services. We'll grab the players service and set it to a variable of players. We're also going to get the run service. So game get service run service. And then we'll also get the server script service game get service server script service. Okay, once we have those three, we're going to get our ProfileStore module. So I'll make a new variable called ProfileStore and then require ProfileStore from the server script service libraries folder that we've created to stay organized. And at this point, we actually need to access our ProfileStore. So we're going to say access ProfileStore here, and we'll create a new variable here, which in this case, yeah, let's call it player store. So this will be the data store that stores data for just players. The way we'll get this is by saying ProfileStore.new, and then we need to give it the name of the data store that we're trying to access. Now, one thing I usually like to do is use two different data stores for live games as well as the in-studio games, like if you're just playing to test things. So generally, I like to make a function right above here, and we can just say get store name, and this will just return if run service is studio, we'll say run service is studio and then this will return test. Or if it's not in studio, we can return live. This separates testing and live data into two data stores so that it's easy for you to reset your data later if you're testing and not worry about accidentally clearing a live player's data. So where we need to pass in the store name, we are going to say get store name. This will return either test or live. And then we also need a template to pass in here. And that template is going to be this template we created later. This says that for every new profile we create inside of this player store, it is going to start off with that base template. So I'll also make a quick variable here, and we'll just call it template, and we can just go ahead and require server script service.data.template. And then we'll pass template into the new profile store. So the next thing we're going to have to handle here is when a player joins the game, we need to give them a profile. So we'll just make a new event listener called players player added, and then we'll connect that to a function that we'll create right here. And we'll just call it player added and make sure to pass in the player. And then we can even type check it as a player just so that we have access to all of the player's properties without having to worry about mistyping them or anything like that. And then I'll just paste in player added to connect the event. And so the first thing we need to do here is start a new profile session. So whether or not the player has joined your game before, our player store will have the same function to get an existing or to get a previous profile. So we'll say local profile equals player store and then start session asynchronously. So what we need to pass into this is the key or the name of our profile for the player. I generally like to say player underscore and then append to the end of that the player's user ID, so player.userid. That way it's really easy to sort through and find things later for GDPR compliance, or just in case you want to search up your own profile, you can just paste in player underscore and then paste your user ID there. And then we're going to need to pass in a table to this as well with a cancel parameter. This cancel parameter is going to be a function that checks if the profile needs to clean itself up. This is how ProfileStore handles something going wrong, like the player getting disconnected. So in here, what we're really just going to do is say if the player.parent is not equal to the player's service, we know that either the server is shut down, the script is dying, or something's going wrong. Maybe the player got kicked from the game. And in that case, it's going to cancel the profile and end the profile session. And whenever it ends the profile session, it just cleans up the data, sends it to the data store, and you don't have to worry about losing data in any of those cases. So now that we've got the profile, we're going to do a quick sanity check here to make sure the profile exists. So to ensure profile exists. Since this is an asynchronous call, we always need to check if it returns a proper value. And if it doesn't, we can handle that edge case. But we can say if profile is not equal to nil, so if profile does exist here, then we're all set. But just in case something goes wrong and the profile doesn't exist, which in this case only ever happens if the server shuts down while the player is joining. And in that case, we just want to kick the player, and we'll give them a nice error message. We'll say something like data error occurred, and then please rejoin. That will probably almost never happen. And if it does, the player can always just rejoin, and especially if we tell them to right there. But once we have the profile, there are a couple of functions we need to run on it. The first thing we need to do is add the user ID of the player into the metadata of the profile. So we can just do that by saying profile add user ID. and then passing in the player's user ID. This is for GDPR compliance, which is Roblox's data deletion policy that's complying with federal regulation. So if players want to go in and have their private data removed from Roblox, as developers, we have to respect that and go in and remove it. This makes it really easy to find that player's data when one of these problems occurs. And so once that's added in, we also want to say profile reconcile. And what the reconcile function does is it's going to fill in missing data variables from the template. So if the template changes in between a player's session, like if we come in here and add a variable called gems maybe and start a player at 5 gems, but a player joined before we added that, this function here is going to check, see that it's missing, and then fill in all of the missing variables there with just the default template values. So if you don't want that to happen and you want exclusive variables to exist for early players, you don't have to add this in, but it's something you should usually do so that it makes it so that you can edit this template super easily and not have to worry about a player missing data. So this profile has a few built-in events with it, and those are events that we can actually listen to and make changes to player data when they happen. So the first one we're going to listen to is profile.onSessionEnd. And we can just connect to this like a normal Roblox event. So connect and then give it a function. On session end is what's going to happen once this cancel function runs or once you manually end the session of the profile. And this is just saying either the player is leaving or the player signed in on another server. And either way, it's time to stop messing with this player's data because we're going to want to prevent any item duplications. This is the session locking component coming in. So once we detect that a profile session has ended, it's pretty easy. We just kick the player. So we'll say as an error message, something like, again, data error occurred. This is one that I generally feel like sounds very professional. And then you can say, please rejoin. So I guess same message as before. And then let me add in a comment here as well so we know what's going on. So now we'll add in another check inside of this function. And we're going to check if the player's parent equals the player's service, just as one more layer of sanity check so that we know what's going on. And here the profile is essentially set up. So at this point, what we actually want to do is start saving the profile somewhere so that we can access it and change the data later. The way we're going to do this, since this is a normal script, is by adding in another module into our data folder on the right. So we'll make a new module, and I generally like to call this one DataManager. And since it's a module, you can require this and access it elsewhere. And inside DataManager, we just need to create a new table inside of DataManager. So DataManager.profiles equals a new table. And of course, this table will store profiles from ProfileStore so that we can access player data and edit it later on. We'll get back to this module in a minute, but for now, we're just going to create this variable here and then go back to our script. Right here under the template, we'll require it by saying local DataManager equals require server script service .data .DataManager. And then we'll copy DataManager. And down here, we've checked that the player's parent is the player's service and the profile exists. So now we're going to say DataManager.profiles, open a bracket and set the index to the player and then assign the profile to that. This means we can access this profile at any time going forward by getting a reference to the DataManager module and then saying .profiles of player, and that will just return us their profile. And now that we're here and we've checked if the player's parent equals the player's, of course we've saved it, but if the player's parent is not the player's service, then we're just going to take this profile and say end session. End session again is going to fire this callback on session end, so it points us back up to player kick. And it means something has gone wrong once again. So that's another error handling setup that we have here. But from this point on, we are very close to being done and we know what everything here does. There are a few more things I want to take care of right now. For one, on session end here, we need to now get the data manager profiles and then just set the player to nil here. We don't want to save the profile. Otherwise that would be a memory leak on the server end. And then once the player has joined, this right here is a prime spot for us to add in some leader stats or any other variables. So I like to add in another function inside of my data init script, and we'll call the function initialize. And then of course we'll pass in the player. We can get the player object, and then we'll also pass in the profile. And one interesting thing, if you want to type check profiles, you don't have to, but what you can do is say type of, which is Luau's magic function for getting types. We'll say ProfileStore start session async, and this will just get the type of profile so that we still have access to all of Profile's methods and variables inside of this function. So we have this initialize function. Let's make sure we call it so we don't forget later. So right after we save the profile, we'll initialize with player and then also pass in the profile. And since this player added function creates and stores our profile, this initialize function can either trigger events that you want when a player joins the game and their data's been loaded. It can send data to the client that you need them to display locally. You can do all kinds of things in here. We can also add leader stats. So we'll say add leader stats and synchronize player data, something like that. Inside this initialize function though, we're going to set up our leader stats really quick. And since we have this gold in this gems category, that should be something we can use for leader stats. So to start with the leader stats portion of this, we just need to make a new variable, call it leader stats like this, and we'll instance a new folder underneath the player. And now the name of this folder is actually very important. The name needs to be leader stats with a lowercase l. That's how you get that to show up there. And then inside of that leader stats folder, let's say local gold equals a number value, of course. So once there's a new number value, and put that into the leader stats folder. And then we can just say gold.name equals gold and gold.value equals profile. And now here's a good test. The way you access your data from a profile of the player is you say profile.data, and data is going to be the same table that template is when a new profile is created. So if I want to get gold from the profile, I say profile.data.gold. You can see it was kind of auto completing there. Since we had type checked it gold, boom, number. We can also do gems. So we'll say local gems equals instance.new number value under leader stats, and then gems.name will be gems. Ton of typos there. Gems.value is going to be profile.data again, .gems. Cool, so we've initialized some leader stats. The other thing I like to do in the initialization function here is sync player data. If we have something like gold, and maybe we don't just want to display it in leader stats, but we want a UI piece to show how much gold you have, this is a good place for you to get a remote event. So let's make a remote event in replicated storage, and we'll just call it update gold. I'm going to add in a replicated storage service up top, and then take replicated storage. And we can say replicated storage.update gold fire client to the player, and then we can fire through profile.data.gold. And then on the client end, we have a UI listener for this. We'd say, oh, gold changed, and then update it that way. So this is a good way to sync up player data right off the bat as soon as the data is loaded in. All right, so the last thing we need in the data init script here is going to be something to happen once a player leaves the game. So we have player joining. We also just need a basic player leaving. So we'll say players.player removing, connect, and then we'll make a new function with the player here, since this is going to be quite a small function. So then here's a good practice way of getting the profile. So once we need to get it from somewhere, again, outside of this scope where it was created, we'll say local profile equals DataManager.profiles, okay, and then brackets player, whoops, not players. Pass in just the player that we want, and that should return the profile, but it's usually important to have a sanity check here and say if not profile, then return end. Somehow the profile's gone, which in that case, it means that the session has ended before and DataManager nilled out the profile. So we don't need to do anything. But if we do have the profile and it's still there, players leaving, great. We'll say profile end session. And then the last thing we just want to do here is say that DataManager profiles of the player equals nil, so that we're not hanging on to that in our memory. Don't want those memory leaks, guys. That's how your server performance goes way down. And then Roblox is like, oh man, screw this game. I do not like how much money it's costing me to run it. One other important thing to add here is we'll do an early joiners check, just in case someone joins before this part of the script loads. We can say for all of the players in players service, and then we'll just spawn a new task here. and we'll say the player added function again with them. That will just take care of, especially in Studio, that's usually when this happens. Sometimes your player joins the game before the script gets run, and you don't want it to miss this player added connection. Okay, so now we have the initial setup here going on of the profile store. So we can hit play, and of course I'm in a new project, so make sure you have your Studio access to APIs enabled. If you're in a new project, you'll need to go do that in security, and then just say enable Studio access to API services. But if you're updating your existing project, that shouldn't be a problem. And then we can join on in here. And look, here's my leader stats. I have 10 gold, I have 5 gems. That's looking great. But now that we know how to access data and set up the profile store, we need to know how to manipulate that data. Like if you're earning gold, let's say you're earning gems or buying them from the store. And that is what the data manager is for. So let's go back to this script and actually talk about what this is for, why it's important, and why we made a separate script for it. So the data init script that we just finished setting up is of course a script, not a module script, which means we would need bindable events if we wanted to remotely fire any functions inside of it. In this case, it's a lot easier to use a module script for this. It's a lot more scalable and a better framework to structure your game around. And what we're going to do is set up helper functions inside of the data manager for editing the profile data for each player. So let's talk about what that looks like. Let me just set up an example here. Let's say function data manager dot add gold. We need to know when we're adding gold to which player we're adding gold to. So we'll type check that as a player, and then we'll say the amount of gold we're adding, which is going to be a number. So once we have this function set up, we just need to get the profile of the player that we're manipulating the gold of. So we can say datamanager.profiles of the player. And again, remember, we're doing a sanity check. If the profile doesn't exist, then return end. But once we have the profile, it exists, everything's fine. We're going to say profile.data.gold plus equals amount. And in the same way as we're adding it here, we can also update the leader stat here. So we can say player.leader stats.gold.value equals profile.data.gold. So this is now a function that you can call from any server script that you need when you want to add gold to a player. So if you have a whole bunch of server scripts set up and you're trying to add 5 gold from here, add 10 gold from a different shopkeeper maybe, you can require the data manager for all of them, and you have a built-in function that will add gold to the player's data and update their leader stats at the same time, and bonus points as well. This remote event, this update gold that we had earlier, this is a great time to throw that in as well. If we grab a replicated storage reference, we can say right under here, after we've updated the gold and the leader stat, update gold remote event, fire client, and then fire that to the player as well as with their new amount of gold. So let's say we have another script like a shopkeeper who you want to sell items to for gold. Instead of having to access the data store, add the amount of gold you need, also find the leader stats, and then also send through to replicated storage to update it, we can use in our other script a reference to data manager and then call this function. Takes care of all of this code right here. This is generally known as boilerplate code. It's something that if you had it in separate locations, you would have to write multiple lines to do just one thing. So it's going to be a lot easier to put those in data manager. And we also had this gems variable here, so we can easily add in another function for adding gems, datamanager.add gems, and it's going to be the same setup. It's very easy to use once you get going here. Amount, and then that's a number, of course. And then here we can even just copy and paste since this is so similar. So we'll copy this all in. We get the profile. We just need to reference gems instead of gold. So we can remove all these gold references to gems and then have a new remote event. Maybe instead of update gold, just update gems. And then boom. Now let's say gems are a Robux item. A player can buy those and add in gems just like that. And it'll update the leader stats. It'll send it through to the client so they can see what's going on. And in the same way, if we add more of these variables that we want to send through at the beginning, copy and paste in the data init script, update gems, fires through the value. So you can see the benefits of ProfileStore so far are that it's easy to set things up in a very modular way. You don't have to get into the back end of what's going on in ProfileStore, although if you want to, you always can since it's open source. But guys, there are thousands of lines of code in here that you would have to write on your own, and otherwise you can save all of this time, and this handles all of those edge cases for you. Meanwhile, we're free to come into our data manager, set it up like this, and then just have a very modular approach already to handling our data because the hard work's been done for us. So to show you how easy these functions make it, you don't have to follow along with this, but I'm just going to add a really quick script into server script service. So in this demo script, I've just got a really quick loop here. And what this is going to do is every 3 seconds, it'll add 5 gold to my player. And it's of course using the data manager. So once we hit play here, ignoring the weirdly broken animations for some reason. So those errors don't matter because we can look up here and see, boom, every 3 seconds, gold is ticking up by 5. So the leader stat is changing inside my data. The gold is going up. Now I have this plugin here called DataStore Editor, and this lets us take a good look inside of what a live profile looks like inside of the game. Here we're going to connect to a data store called test and then list the keys. Again, test versus live is one of the huge benefits of doing this setup we had in the data init, where we have this get store name function, because I can just hit test and know that it's my in-studio data. So now we have player, here's my user ID, and then inside this is what a profile object looks like inside of it. User IDs, here's my user ID stored for GDPR compliance. There's some metadata, which is empty. Here's when my profile was created, any meta tags you have saved. A lot of these you don't really have to worry about though. The key that we need to pay attention to is data here. In my data, I have 55 gold, 5 gems. Of course, the template has a player starting off with 10 gold, 5 gems, and an empty inventory. And then to show you that this reconcile function here is filling in the missing data variables, if we add another variable into our template, let's just say honor, and hit play, it should have reconciled my data. But if we go back out and we open up my profile again by connecting to the test data store, finding my key and looking at my data, you will see that now I have a variable called honor set to 100 as a base. But guys, that is basically going to be all of the coding that we have to do for this to work. And you can take this same setup and use it in your game to great effect. It's going to handle all of the problems we listed out right at the beginning of the video and just make all of your data management issues a thing of the past. But guys, that's going to be it. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end if you made it, and I really hope this is helpful. I generally don't use any data store solution other than ProfileStore anymore because it's so easy to plug and play. It's working away even as we speak here. I can just take these scripts out of server script service and just copy and paste them into new game files, and without even coding, I already know my data is set up. All you have to do is come in and change the template depending on what your game is, and you're set. You're ready to go. So this should be a huge time saver for you guys. It always is for me. And make sure to go give Mad Studios some love on Roblox. He's a legendary developer. He's the guy who also made Replica Service, of course, ProfileService in the past, which is the older version of this same data store wrapper. And he also has a great style guide on how to write luau code and how to keep your scripts organized. Guys, if you made it to the end of the video, thank you so much. Please like it and subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me, and I really appreciate all the support. But sorry my animations aren't working. That is the weirdest thing. Take care.